weird feeling seeing your whole life rolling away in a van like that.
New horizons, Jack.
Animal Crossing has always been interesting, a series of life sims that, through randomly generated daily content, demands a player parcel out some time every day to play them. That's too juicy, that's too petulant to ignore. But even within the context of an already interesting series, New Horizons is really interesting, and I don't mean that as either a compliment or a criticism. Released in 2020, New Horizons is the culmination of a years-long change in priorities. With each game released, the dial has slid slightly more from a focus on random generation towards a focus on player expression. And on paper, that seems like an improvement. With every prior release, I imagined a subsequent game that was yet freer, yet more expressive, yet more compulsive. But now that I finally have that game, I find myself missing what we've left behind to get here. Is that it? Can I make a whole video whining at Nintendo for how indecisive I am? Aye, of course I can, just you watch me. I'll be going through the game day by day as I work towards a 5-star island, and talking about my thoughts as they become relevant. It's kind of an odd format, usually I would try and come up with some kind of an argument to justify my degree, but this whole video was basically just an excuse to waste so much time in the game anyway, so really, who cares? Welcome to Scenic Dunno. During the intro of the original Animal Crossing, you chose your name and appearance via a short quiz from a cat named Rover. My first time playing, I misunderstood what the game meant when he asked where I was headed. Since I didn't know, I tried to answer, I don't know, but since that didn't fit, I responded, dunno, like an absolute dunce. I immediately realised my mistake, but I liked the name so much that I kept it, possibly as a monument to my own stupidity. I usually end up liking the stupid stuff I do by accident a lot more than my well-laid plans. As I say, Animal Crossing has shifted its focus over the years from randomly generated daily content onto self-expression through town, house, and personal customization. Self-expression has always been a part of the series to some extent. The player has always been able to decorate their house and design their own clothes. But over time it's become the series' main draw. The player's influence has been expanded to the point of letting them change the very land beneath their feet. Leaving my galaxy brain game design rhetorical misgivings to one side for the moment and meeting the game on its own terms, this change makes a lot of sense. In a game about living a second life, it's broadly more enjoyable to have as much influence over that life as possible. But the transition from real-time random generation to self-expression isn't yet fully complete. New Horizons struggles to reconcile its current direction with the series' original conceit, of a real-time town where days came and went with or without the player's involvement. There are still a lot of calendar-based mechanics that interfere with the player's ability to customise the town as they please. My first task when laying out my town was to move the museum 5 or so tiles to the right. Selecting a space costs 50,000 bells and sees the building move overnight. But I ended up having to move the museum twice, costing me 100,000 bells and taking place over 2 nights. The museum's new plot is a physical object, so it can't overlap with any existing buildings, including the museum itself. And because Nook is only able to move 1 building per day, I had to move the museum completely out of the way, wait overnight, and then move it back the next day. This became a problem throughout this project. I often had to postpone construction in certain areas to either make sure that a new structure would fit, or to move an existing structure out of the way. The solutions to this problem are obvious, so obvious that their absence feels like a deliberate choice. Nintendo generally focus on conveyance to an absolute fault. The controls and the context are very easy to understand, making their games a joy to pick up for the first time. Well, usually. But there comes a point where streamlining becomes a problem. New Horizons has prioritised simplicity over convenience. Moving buildings is incredibly clear and incredibly simple. You have to fence off a plot in physical space by moving the character there and having them create it. That makes perfect sense. The game asks you to choose where to erect a building, but rather than abstract that point by disembodying the player and whisking them off to a menu, New Horizons asks you to manually accomplish the task of choosing a plot of land. There is little to no abstraction about it, which makes its rules and limitations incredibly clear. Of course you can't make a construction site if there's already a building there. The design philosophy of forcing a player to engage with a physical space as often as possible allows for a singularity of perspective that I think is very welcoming. It is the romantic ideal of conveyance. Animal Crossing's the kind of game that you could show to your granny without much issue. Ooh, not keen on using the words romantic and granny that close to one another. Don't go seducing your gran with Animal Crossing. Or anything else for that matter. The fact is, moving a character around a world feels good. It's immediate and intelligible in a way that concepts like menus and user interfaces are not, perhaps because it replicates more closely the way we experience the world ourselves. As human beings, we're hardwired to understand a physical 3D space because that's where we exist. So it's to New Horizons' credit that it focused on that rather than disappearing into menus for half the game. But a singular, earthbound perspective has its limits, and it's when a game lacks the nuance of reality, as it inevitably will, that those limits become glaringly obvious. The problem with using a perspective that humans are hardwired to understand is that it becomes distracting when people and objects don't behave as they should. QED, to accomplish my goal of moving the museum a very short distance, I had to move it a much further distance twice. It makes absolutely no sense. If Nook were real, I could have communicated my intentions to him more clearly to save us both time, money, and work. But he isn't real, he's a node of mechanical options dressed up as a cartoon raccoon. And while that fact is never particularly well hidden, it becomes impossible to ignore when the limitations of those mechanical options contradict how you would expect a character to behave. Now, I'm not saying that they should write Nook better. That kind of dynamic, reactive character would be incredibly difficult to write and program, and besides which that's not actually the point. The point is that New Horizons' dedication to simplicity undermines itself by making things a lot more complicated than they need to be. The game is never going to be able to create that kind of dynamic, reactive character, but I wouldn't have had to move the museum twice if those mechanical options had instead been abstracted somehow. I respect New Horizons' dedication to conveyance, but it would have been a lot more convenient if there had simply been some kind of a menu where I could move the museum wherever I pleased. Going through a menu may be slightly more difficult for a new player to wrap their head around, but it would also be quicker, cheaper, and easier for them to accomplish their goals using it, and it would avoid them running headfirst into some of the inherent limitations of a computer game to boot. Another problem with the singular perspective is that it means every change has to be made manually. Terraforming is New Horizons' unique selling point, allowing the player to change the very landscape as they please. The feature was intended to canonise certain behaviours and trends from the older titles. Some players used to reset the game at the start until they got a layout that they liked, and many would use custom designs to create paths around their villages. Both of these were kind of janky workarounds that players used to, fundamentally, assert more control over their villages. Through terraforming, players can now express specific intentions rather than roll the dice over and over until they get close enough to what they want. Personally, I've never been bothered enough to reset my game at the start or to create paths through my village, but New Horizons sparked a creative interest in me just by framing those workarounds as an intended mechanic. Animal Crossing has always required a level of independent engagement for its busy work to be meaningful. There is no endgame or finale, so the player needs to commit to the game on their own terms, to ascribe meaning to their village and its inhabitants, and to want to see it improve. Giving the player more creative control is the perfect way to expand that gameplay, as there's more room to give meaning to a space that you yourself created. With this amount of control, I couldn't help but imagine a large island in the middle where most of my villagers would go. But if you've been paying attention to the footage, or indeed have played the game yourself, you should have a pretty good idea what my problem is. The controls simply aren't precise enough for a lot of the tasks that New Horizons allows the player to perform. The control scheme is, in a vacuum, a credit to the game. New Horizons conveys itself masterfully, and one of the ways that it accomplishes this is consistency. Inputs are standardised across all tools and items. A, to use your held item or to interact with animals and objects, B, to run, and Y, to pick things up. It's simple and constant across all items, which makes it really easy to explain and understand. But that simplicity again becomes a discredit when the controls so frequently misinterpret the player's intentions. If the mechanics are to be engaged with primarily through direct control of a character, then controlling that character needs to be more reliable than it is currently. Pressing A while terraforming causes your character to attack a tile vaguely in front of them with a shovel, cycling through 3 options: an empty tile, a full tile, and when conditions are right, a tile with the corner shaved off. But, as comical as it sounds, I often find myself missing the tile I want. I literally can't hit the ground with a shovel. There's no concrete indication which tile the character is facing, which becomes a problem as the movement isn't one-to-one with the analog stick. Sharp changes in direction will cause the character to pivot where they stand, rather than turn immediately. There's a slight delay between tilting the stick and the character facing that direction. The character also seems to overcorrect for minute changes in direction. If the character isn't facing a tile head on, they slide over and hit the tile that they're tended towards. Say you're organising a flower patch and you want to fill in a hole. If you press A, then you run the risk of missing and digging a new hole, whereupon you will need to fill it back in and possibly replant some flowers. If you press Y, it's a coin toss whether you're going to fill in the hole or pocket the head of the nearest flower. Trying to pluck weeds near furniture is a similar nightmare. The character seems to prioritise furniture and, upon pressing Y, will suddenly swivel to pocket a desk or a chair rather than the weeds in front of them. Jumping, which is conceptually a great little quality of life improvement, is similarly inconsistent. The character will sometimes leap over a gap with the slightest nudge of the analog stick, but refuse to jump back even while being rubbed against an edge for seconds at a time. These control issues are relatively minor, as all of these mistakes are easy to undo, but they become frustrating because, even when the controls behave themselves, performing these tasks across any kind of significant space is such a laborious process. Each tile has to be dealt with individually, meaning that if you're terraforming a large area, such as, say, if you're creating a river, which I can only imagine was the whole point of the water permit in the first place, it's going to take an unreasonable amount of time. For each tile, the character will hit the ground as if to dislodge some tough dirt before breaking it loose, and while that does sell the action, it also doubles the time it takes to demolish something. The benefit of this is questionable. It's a thoughtful little detail, but it adds a layer of reality to an action that feels fundamentally unreal. There are other limitations to terraforming besides. Sometimes my character will bounce off a cliff that I know can be demolished because they're at slightly the wrong angle. Rounded path corners can't be built atop rounded cliffs, and waterfalls can't be created from below, meaning that you have to equip and unequip the ladder more frequently. I respect the game's dedication to simplicity, but I begin to have mixed feelings about it when it comes with such a heavy cost in terms of consistency. Terraforming is a huge sinkhole of potentially wasted time, and it's difficult not to wish the controls were more robust and the experience less cumbersome. As I've said, there are massive benefits to eliminating abstractions. You're supposed to be doing laborious work, and the easiest way to make that intelligible is to have players actually perform that work themselves. Even something as seemingly innocuous as an indicator on the ground showing which tile you're aiming for would come with a small trade-off in terms of simplicity. But to get that benefit, there's a far more problematic trade-off in terms of enjoyment. You can spend hours and hours mindlessly hacking away at the ground to fulfill a vision that you decided upon almost instantly. And God help you if you, like me, are indecisive. Each indecision can potentially eat away hours of your life. Looking at it like that, it's hard to defend the dedication to a singular perspective. And it only becomes harder when the game breaks this rule and whisks you away to a top-down God mode when you're arranging your furniture indoors anyway. Come on guys, I'm trying to stand up for you here and you have to go and stab me in the back like this. The museum caused yet more problems today. The options to lay out structures are limited by the rigid tile system. I was unable to place a set of stairs directly in front of the museum as it's 7 tiles wide, while stairs are 2 tiles wide each. As you can't move structures in half-tile increments like you can with furniture, this means that the stairs are always going to be slightly offset. The obvious suggestion would be to have structures act more like furniture, and allow the player to place them in half-tile increments. The way it is now objectively limits the player's options. But after thinking about it for a while, I think this is probably the right way to do it. There has to be a limit at some point. If you allow the player to move things in half tiles, there will probably be a scenario where a player ends up wishing that they can move things in quarter tiles, and at that point you may as well not bother having tiles at all. That might sound good on paper, but I can imagine it would be a lot more difficult to control and program. Besides, while limitations restrict options, that often breeds more creativity, not less. To overcome a limitation, you're forced to challenge your presumptions and define your priorities, which can lead to a greater focus on solutions appropriate to your project. To solve my problem, I built 2 sets of stairs with a little gap in the middle, which I think looks a bit nicer than my original plan. So I've kinda talked myself into liking limitations, at least sometimes. But that doesn't mean that every limitation is inherently good. The player is also unable to change the location of the resident services building. Choosing your island's layout at the beginning of the game is essentially just choosing your river mouths, the shape of your beach, and the location of your airport and resident services building. Through terraforming you can change the cliffs and rivers, and through resident services you can choose where all the rest of the buildings should go. I don't have an issue with the beach's layout being rigid because it doesn't really affect anything else. It's just the last wee vestigial bit from when this series was about random generation. But the resident services building interacts with other mechanics, and not being able to move it seems like a much bigger shortcoming. Villagers and guests tend to congregate outside, and it's the only place in the island that you can withdraw and deposit money. My resident services ended up fairly out of the way, so if I find something expensive in Nook's and have to withdraw some cash, it's a long trek across an empty town square to the ATM. Why sing at the microphone that I put in the middle of town when you can just go and sing in front of a busy office? Nook must be going off his nut in there. I'm also not keen on the fact there's limited room for planning. I can't see how the layout of the stairs in the museum will look before finalising my decision. I can see a limited preview of the structure I'm about to build before committing to the decision, but that means I'll only really get a limited view of what this looks like once I've previewed the second staircase. If I decided after the fact that I wanted a 3-tile gap in the middle, or that I wanted a different style of staircase, I would have wasted a further 3 nights and 356,000 bells sorting it out. You have to wait a night between demolishing and building structures, so the penalty for deciding that you don't like a layout involving multiple structures is really steep. In other words, structures are high commitment. Furniture can be placed and moved around in real time, allowing experimentation and decision making to happen simultaneously, but structures have to be planned out in advance and then committed to with a large time and money investment. High commitment items demand good planning on the player's part to make the most out of them, which wouldn't be a problem if it weren't for the fact that the planning tools are practically non-existent. There's no way to see how different structures will work in different places until you've committed to placing them. There isn't even any kind of measurement tool. You'll notice that I've had to mark tiles myself to lay everything out. Without these planning tools, it takes an unreasonable amount of foresight to anticipate problems with a layout involving multiple structures. Ideally, there would be some kind of planning space to let the player decide upon their layout before they have to commit time and money to it. This could easily be contextualised by a town blueprint on Nook's desk, or even just an app on the character's phone. Dedicating yourself to the task of planning out a small segment of town would be an interesting, productive, and satisfying way to spend some time. Afterwards, you would be able to quickly and easily refer to your plan while going about your daily chores. Animal Crossing isn't necessarily incompatible with high commitment decisions, but they have to be accounted for differently to most of its other mechanics. It was while terraforming the following day that Genji decided to plonk himself in my way and not move. I don't think this warrants much explanation in and of itself. It's pretty obvious why that's frustrating. There's no deep thought, philosophical game design analysis to be had here. But the idea that a villager is a hindrance to the gameplay rather than a core part of it is interesting to me. Animal Crossing used to be predicated on these villager characters. The series was inspired by Katsuya Iguchi's experiences moving to Kyoto and leaving his family and friends behind. He wanted to recreate the experience of being alone in a new town, and so the first Animal Crossing saw the player entering a space that these animal characters were already living in, and carving out their own space there. The fact that you were an outsider was reflected in the fact that you're the only human character there. It was a big metaphor for living in a new community. But the focus in New Horizons is on creating a space rather than living in that space, and so the villagers are a lot less important. You move in at the same time as two villagers and immediately get singled out as the one who's going to make all the decisions. It's a huge change in the power dynamic, and to accomplish this, the villagers cannot be allowed to have agency. All games are fundamentally about obstacles. A challenge as simple as walk to the other side of an empty room is still an obstacle that needs to be overcome by pushing forward on the analog stick. In the earliest Animal Crossing games, the villagers were the obstacles because they had agency. They had their own desires, agendas, and hobbies that the player needed to take into account to navigate this social space. As a result, the villagers were a lot more adversarial. They were contentious in terms of writing, particularly in the first game, but more importantly they were contentious in terms of gameplay. They would demand items and favours, and they would get annoyed with you if you failed to meet their request within the allotted time. If they wanted to move out, they would just move out without so much as a bye or leave. They wouldn't even say bye, they would just leave. Does that count as a joke? I don't think so. The major obstacle in New Horizons is instead the landscape. It's in a shape that you don't want, and it's up to you to get it how you like it. If the villagers still had that contentious sense of agency, they would only interfere with you overcoming that obstacle. If they could catch the bugs or fish that they're miming being after, that would potentially rob you of the precious opportunity to collect Nook miles and fill in your Critterpedia. So they can't. You can boss them around however you like. Return a gift they gave you and they won't call you out on it. Demand they move house multiple days in a row and they'll never protest even once. They can't, of course they can't. The game is about creating your ideal island, and if one of the NPCs just randomly decided no, that would lead to frustration as you couldn't overcome the game's major obstacle and accomplish your goals. So very few of the player's interactions with the villagers have a mechanical impact. Talking to them for the first time every day and giving them a gift raises their friendship level, but unless they approach you, which happens fairly infrequently, they won't have anything else except spouting flavour text that soon becomes repetitive. Giving them gifts is a nice option, but it's easily exploitable. It eventually just becomes a grind, as to maximise potential friendship gains, you have to give them one gift each day. Bespoke gifts will elicit more favourable responses from the villagers, which is a caring touch, but the only difference is how much their friendship increases. And with the sheer volume of gifts you end up firing at them, it never seems worth my time to be too precious about what gifts I'm choosing for whom. The higher your friendship level, the more the villagers will try and show you how much they care about you. On paper, that makes a lot of sense, with the game attempting to reflect your growing relationship. It's quite sweet, but in practice, it just means that the closer you become, the more they just repeat things you've accomplished back to you to demonstrate they've been paying attention. Again, that makes sense. You ask people about their day, what they've been up to, and demonstrate through conversation how much you know about them and their lives. But all it results in mechanically is the villagers telling you things that you already know. Oh, I was digging up fossils yesterday, was I? Righto. The villagers have always been at least somewhat mechanical, as fostering a relationship with them would reward the player with money and furniture. But their mechanical purpose is so obvious and so one-dimensional in New Horizons that it discourages any kind of meaningful emotional investment. I must confess, I don't miss having to wander all over the village looking for a villager that's gone AWOL so I can deliver them a parcel, but at least that gave them an appealing sense of independence. They weren't just waiting around for you all day, they were off doing their own thing. But the relationship is so obviously artificial in New Horizons that the villagers feel very much like nodes. Eventually, I just stopped bothering to talk to them because I could predict what they were going to say verbatim, and I knew that talking to them wouldn't yield any kind of mechanical reward. The reason that I could tell what a villager was going to say verbatim is because of their limited range of dialogue. Villagers are put together from a basic model, a skin, and one of 8 pre-selected personalities. This is obviously a shortcut. You couldn't possibly write bespoke dialogue for 391 villagers. But there are 8 personality types and 10 slots for villagers on an island, meaning that every player is going to have at least 2 villagers who behave identically to another. I have multiple villagers with identical personalities, and hearing the same speeches out of different mouths ruins the illusion of them being distinct people. Of course, there would be massive diminishing returns improving this, so maybe it's better that they don't bother. Each new personality type would require a ton more writing and localization work, and even if you doubled them, a lot of players would get duplicate personality types anyway. Furthermore, I feel like the designs help distinguish them as characters. Even if they're saying the exact same things, the way that's recontextualised by the visuals is enough to separate them somewhat. Better, I feel, to put that effort into having the villagers engage with the player more naturally. Giving them a bigger role in the game, for example, would diversify their interactions and make them feel less rote. But there are other possibilities. There's a lot of detail in the villagers' animations and actions that are worth shining a spotlight on. They have their own hobbies, with certain characters being more likely to read and others more likely to run. They will respond when there's a tarantula or a scorpion around. They will respond when you've been stung by bees, and they will express appropriately when you use a reaction around them. But the detail on that last one isn't carried through. Talking to them afterwards won't provoke any further response. You can walk up clearly raging, and they'll behave as if nothing's wrong. It's always going to be difficult to simulate interpersonal relationships using a mechanical algorithm, but the best games, and even previous games in this same series, do their best to hide the seams. New Horizons fails to hide the seams. If anything, it highlights them. The villagers, functionally, have gone from simulations of real people to ornaments that you decorate your town with. They're no longer their own people. People have their own goals, agendas, and personalities. But that'd be incompatible with the core mechanical theme of self-expression, so even the slightest chance for friction has been sanded off. And so what we're left with is this. A villager who used to be the gameplay in Animal Crossing, literally getting in the way of the gameplay. What do you know? I guess there was a deep philosophical game design analysis to be had here after all. They call me the stallion of game analysis. Give me some straw and I will make it into horse shit. It's very easy for me to let this by. It's the kind of limitation that arises when bringing a fantasy into the sticky world of reality. But I'm not particularly inclined to be kind at the minute, as there's a pretty sinister undercurrent to the ornamentation of the villagers. While New Horizons doesn't include any kind of microtransactions within itself, that hasn't stopped Animal Crossing from giving into the temptation of some crass monetization practices. The reduced emphasis on interpersonal relationships and the milquetoast interactions with the villagers has placed more of an emphasis on the characters' aesthetics than ever before. And Nintendo have capitalised on that by re-releasing the associated Animal Crossing amiibo cards alongside the game. These collectible cards are £3 to a £4 pack, and give the player the opportunity to invite specific villagers featured on those cards into their town. Rather than try and forge relationships with quote-unquote ugly villagers to make them meaningful through a simulated relationship, a dedicated community was created to trade and literally sell desirable villagers like Raymond. There's even a whole economy springing up around Nook Miles tickets. Villagers' one-dimensional, people-pleasing personalities combined with their newfound collectible nature creates enough emotional distance for players to use them as currency. I really like Anka, for example, but what would it mean if I spent money to get her in my town? She wouldn't be meaningful because of a gameplay experience, but because she's a trophy. If you've ever played a collectible card game, it's easy to see where this is going. People, pressured into a purchase by others showing off their rare or desirable villagers online, have ravenously snapped up these card packs. Nobody benefits more from this arrangement in the short term than the remora to Nintendo's shark, the scalpers, who are now selling the most popular amiibo cards on eBay for astronomical prices. I don't think that Nintendo are naive enough to not have predicted this, especially after what happened with their miniature classic consoles. The company has a storied history with scalpers reselling their undersupplied products at an unreasonable markup. It's a classic toy company move. The more demand they create now, the more they can capitalise on that increased demand when they finally supply appropriately. Of course, I can't substantiate any of that, Nintendo would never come out and admit it. It is, at best, an educated guess. But at the very least, I suspect Nintendo probably aren't as innocent as they would like you to think they are. The monetization is nowhere near as bad as it could be, but it's still unsettlingly cynical for a game about crafting relationships with these characters. And I'm not trying to tell you not to trade or buy villagers. Do what you like, you don't answer to me. But I think it's important to understand that, intentionally or otherwise, the game design has enabled this behaviour. Before I move on, if you would like more detail on any of the things I've discussed here and you have a further hour to spare, I'd like to direct you to Tama Hiroka's video on villagers, which goes into a lot more detail on how the characters worked throughout the series. It was a really helpful video to discover when I was making this. Part of my criticism with the commodification of villagers was the idea of certain characters being ugly, and I want to make sure that I'm not misunderstood. I'm bothered by problematic monetization rather than the idea of players finding certain villagers ugly. Because, well, to be frank, some of them are. I know, I hear you, glass houses, but I do think there are quantifiable shortcomings to some of the character designs, particularly those villagers returning from the original Animal Crossing. Now, I can't possibly go through every single villager, so my subject for this case study is going to be Allie. The joke with Allie is that she's an alligator. Damn, that's a discerning observation. She's a creature notorious for its bumpy, leathery hide and its short temper, dressing herself up to be graceful and beautiful. The very fact that she has a unique texture adds a characterising quirk, colouring her stock dialogue slightly differently to the other snooty villagers. It's very likeable. I chose Allie for two very important reasons. First, she's in my town, and second, she's been around since the original Dobutsu no Mori on the Nintendo 64. In short, this design is almost 20 years old and was made for a pioneering 3D console. Bringing this character onto a modern day console, even one with the comparatively modest power of the Switch, is going to require a lot of subtle changes to the character design. The first thing to note are the inherent problems with porting a character to an entirely different game on an entirely different system. A huge increase in graphical power and resolution means that the character needs a smoother model with higher resolution textures that can stand up to scrutiny under more advanced lighting. New Horizons is also a markedly different game to the original Animal Crossing, and so the character designs have to be changed to accommodate different priorities and mechanics. Villagers' bodies have to be longer in general to account for the greater range of clothing options, foregoing the proportions a lot of these villagers were designed for. The change in art style is also important to note. Like many recent Nintendo games, such as Yoshi's Crafted World and the Link's Awakening remake, New Horizons attempts to replicate the impression that its world is a toy or diorama. Personally, I've never been convinced of the benefits. It's impressive and charming in its own way. It must take a lot of work to get everything feeling like a plastic toy, requiring realistic lighting, exaggerated reflections, and a shallow depth of field. But it also feels like a capitulation to the limitations of games, as it admits quite brazenly that the world you're looking at isn't real. In older games, it was possible to interpret the simple sprites or models how you liked, but when the game is so specifically and successfully calling to mind the sensation of looking at a toy, that becomes more difficult to interpret as anything other than a toy. Anyway, New Horizons looks like a toy, and while the effort is commendable, I feel it kind of contradicts itself a little in doing so. Bump mapping gives villagers the impression of being slightly fuzzy, with their eyes and other facial features being slightly indented, making them look like plush toys rather than cartoon characters. And I think that the flatter textures and squatter bodies of the original did more justice to the cartoony designs. Look at Ali's eyes. In the original, you couldn't notice a distinction between her eyes and the rest of her head. The flat textures of the original, viewed in a lower resolution on an old CRT television, would disguise some of the rougher edges of the model, making her look like a flat cartoon rather than a plush doll. In New Horizons, there's a noticeable seam, which also allows you to notice the fact that her eye textures don't quite fill the entirety of the eye segment. The new model makes no attempt to disguise the fact that the crocodile's eyes are just plonked on top of the rest of their head. They no longer round down into the back of the head naturally, but instead sit on top like Yoshi's eyes. This isn't inherently a bad decision, but I feel that it clashes with the slightly taller bodies that New Horizons requires. I think it's slightly uncanny personally, but even if you disagree, at the very least you have to admit it reads differently to the original design. I'm not saying this is negligence or incompetence on the part of the designers. They have so many villagers to design, and this is still absolutely the same character. Nor am I saying that every legacy design is a flop. All I'm saying is, even if you can't put your finger on why, I'm sure there are some little subtleties that add up to a character design that looked fine in the past, looking less appealing in the series' new style. I might have burned a few bridges by slagging Ali off so much there, so let's maybe start building some bridges instead. After choosing the new spot for a bridge or an incline, Lloid, lamentably the only gyroid in this game, will start taking donations towards its construction. The game essentially frames the erection of a new structure as a crowdsourcing project. New structures are generally pretty expensive, and this is a way to offset the cost by having multiple people pay for it. Anybody, including villagers and visitors to your town, can chip in as much as they like to get the bridge funded. Aye, that sounds nice, doesn't it? A nice wee structure that your whole village contributes to. The problem is, you're going to be contributing most, if not all the money yourself. Of course you are, otherwise there'd be no game. Villagers only ever contribute a pittance, and in my experience, visitors will save their money to fund their own projects at home. Maybe that says something about the quality of my cheapskate friends, I don't know. Regardless, choose to wait and you'll be waiting a while, and all that time that area is inaccessible and you won't be able to place any new structures. I can imagine this feature being much more worthwhile when you have more than one player in a single town, allowing the players to divide the costs. But anecdotally, it seems that most players just end up withdrawing the cash from the ATM and paying it off as soon as the spot is chosen. It seems that most players' experience of Lloid is just as another step in what is already a multi-step process. What confuses me though is that there's a really obvious and far simpler alternative that would enrich existing systems and still allow for some crowdsourcing. If the player were able to craft the structures they want to put in their village, then they could still enlist the help of others to gather materials while simultaneously having more control over the project. The reason I describe that as confusing is that's literally what the game asks you to do for the first bridge you create. Unfortunately, I don't have any footage of this as I started recording long after completing this bit of the game, but the game essentially asks the player to gather the materials, craft the bridge construction kit, and then choose a spot themselves. Then Nook will build the bridge overnight. This system seems superior as it demonstrates a clearer set of priorities, giving the crafting materials more value as the player needs to decide what projects to use them on. These crafting projects would even be some of the relatively few that aren't just ornamental. Now, of course, my perspective is limited. That seems to have been considered at some stage, and it may well be that during playtesting they found that the structures were too resource intensive or something. But on paper, crafting structures makes a lot more sense to me than crowdsourcing them. A large topic when discussing Animal Crossing's slow slide to player expression is quality of life improvements. Play the original Animal Crossing and New Horizons back to back, and the difference is night and day. It makes sense that the game that lets the player basically do what they want would be orders of magnitude more convenient. But this convenience has obsoleted some features that still exist in the game nevertheless. KK Slider, for example, has always visited the town on a Saturday evening, playing a concert and then giving the player a record to commemorate his visit. These records were rare and valuable, as only one could be obtained per week. In New Horizons, a new record can be bought every single day, so while KK Slider hasn't changed himself, I can't bring myself to care about him in this game. He feels like more of a waste of time because there's no longer any reason to attend his concerts, unless you're really into seeing the credits roll again. Feature creep has muscled him out of the way and made him irrelevant. Maybe it's a metaphor for the music industry. Another mechanic made obsolete by convenience is flowers. Flowers no longer need to be watered, and running over them or plucking them will leave the stems intact, allowing them to regrow after a couple of days. And at first, that concession felt a lot more freeing. Accidentally digging up flowers felt bad. Accidentally running them over felt bad. Forgetting to water them and seeing them wilt felt bad, but streamlining efforts have reduced flowers to a mechanical non-entity. I find myself almost resentful of them. They feel disposable because mistreating them has no consequence. You can dig them up and replant them as much as you like, pluck the heads off them as much as you like, trample all over them as much as you like, and water them as little as you like, and nothing bad will ever happen to them. They will never die. For a game with so much emphasis on decoration, you would expect nurturing the purely decorative flowers to be a more involved process. The question I'm struggling with then is whether or not I consider this a bad change. A lot of the time I appreciate consequences as a necessary part of a game and still think they're tedious. The series has always had sluggish feedback, so it takes a lot of time and energy to correct any mistakes. I certainly don't miss having to stress about flowers every time I wanted to run. But having flowers be invincible seems like an overcorrection because now it's practically impossible to make a mistake at all. And while that does reduce frustration, particularly when crossbreeding species, it also means it's less satisfying when you get them right because there was never any tension or possibility of getting them wrong. Now, it would be an oversimplification to say that there's a direct correlation between convenience and quality. I criticise terraforming for being too cumbersome, for example, and I don't think that's a contradiction. Flowers and terraforming are two sides of the same coin. Flowers are too convenient for accomplishing your goal to be satisfying, while terraforming is too inconvenient moment to moment for accomplishing your goal to be worth the tedium. It must be difficult to walk that tightrope, but there's a sweet spot somewhere in the middle that neither quite reach. The superannuation of certain traditions becomes more of an inevitability as a series goes on. Eventually, a new mechanic is going to obsolete an old one that is still included for whatever reason. But New Horizons also discards some great features that the series had previously introduced. New Leaf introduced the idea of ordinances, allowing the player to tweak the animal's behaviour to better suit their lifestyle. For example, if you were likely to play early in the morning, the early bird ordinance meant that the shops opened and closed earlier. If you were likely to play later at night, such as, say, if you had a 9 to 5, the night owl ordinance would keep the shops open later. And if you didn't fancy wasting a significant amount of time every day gardening, the beautiful town ordinance would make the villagers do it in your stead. It's this ordinance that I missed this time around. Watering an entire town's worth of flowers single-handedly quickly becomes tiresome. Now, admittedly, villagers will sometimes deign to water a flower, and there's less urgency in general as flowers can no longer die. You can skip a day whenever you feel like it. But regardless, giving the player options to customise their experience, especially in a game that demands as much consistent attention as Animal Crossing, seems like a no-brainer. So the question becomes, why was this feature removed? While I don't have any confirmation, I have some hunches about why this feature is missing. Maybe the developers felt the feature didn't fit this game as you're no longer playing as a mayor. Or perhaps they felt that crafting made the play hours more flexible in general. Love it or hate it, Nintendo have always been mercurial, and they tend to prize oddly specific themes to the exclusion of convenience. I can't help but respect that, even as I disagree with their decisions. Customization mechanics have made the game slightly more generic. I could turn to many other games to get my crafting and gathering fix. But the upshot of Nintendo prizing oddly specific themes is that they know how to take popular mechanics and make sense of them anew. Gathering materials and using them to craft inherently makes the game a lot more compulsive. There's always something to be doing, whether it be stocking up on wood or customising your crafted furniture's colour palette. Making a game more compulsive is, in a lot of ways, an improvement. The game feels more focused than it did previously, and there's enough content here to keep you going for hours on end every day, rather than just a half hour. But there's perhaps something to be lamented in the loss of the unique experience that only Animal Crossing could offer. Like I say, I could turn to dozens of other games for compulsive crafting and gathering, but there was only one series that had the lazy pace of a day-to-day life in a small village. Still, it's a very clean fit for the series. Gathering enriches many items in Animal Crossing. Trees, rocks, fruit, and even weeds are now made more valuable, with the player's pockets expanded to match the number of items they're now going to be lugging around. Trees and rocks benefit in particular, becoming a regular part of the player's daily activities because they yield wood and minerals respectively when struck. Rocks can also be demolished and fully grown trees pocketed and replanted. This is why fruit is more valuable. You need to eat a piece of fruit to have the strength to perform these tasks. It's a very elegant change, neatly tying some unrelated mechanics together and making trees and rocks even more interactive. It's also sensible taking into account island customization. Having to chop down and replant trees individually would be a huge headache. Fruit have become so valuable, in fact, that the Nooklings sell them from their store, so you're never in danger of running out. In previous games, besides New Leaf, rocks were basically complete non-entities, serving no purpose and having no interactive possibilities outside of a single, well-known secret. Each day, a random rock in the village would be chosen to be a bell rock and would dispense bells when struck. To get the maximum number of bells, the player needed to hit the rock 8 times within a fairly strict time limit, so the player had to dig holes in front of every rock to prevent recoil. It was a cool little secret that's now been folded into the regular gameplay as minerals are dislodged using exactly the same mechanic. This makes a lot of sense, meaning veteran players feel right at home and making newcomers or people without the internet a lot more likely to find out about the Bell Rock secret. But digging holes behind every rock was always tedious, and while I never minded it too much when it was a workaround to make the most of a secret little bonus, it's out of place when it's a part of the core mechanics. It still feels like an untidy exploit rather than an intended way to play the game. Crafting is made worthwhile due to its sheer scope and its thematic parity. There are loads of furnishings and clothes to make, most of which use a small pool of easily gathered materials, making those materials yet more valuable. The crafting is also very easy to understand. It's the perfect choice for a game about self-expression, and moreover it ties itself neatly into the new setting of living on a deserted island. There's a clear association between the island theme and the survival aspect of crafting and gathering, an association that's made explicit when one of the first things you're expected to craft is a bonfire. Gathering and crafting are further enriched, I suppose, by item degradation. After around 100 uses, your items will break, and this never stops being a chore. The idea itself isn't inherently bad, as it gives you more decisions to make about what items to use your crafting materials on. But the system doesn't frame itself as a decision, but an interruption, because it's so totally without nuance. There's no option to repair damaged tools or to upgrade to more durable ones, and there isn't even any indication of how damaged your tool is. There's no decision to be made here, you simply use your tools until they break, toddle off to a workbench to craft a new one, and then come back and resume what you were doing. It's simply a waste of time. It makes no sense either, even the watering can will fall apart with overuse. This is normally a criticism I'd try and qualify, as the watering can breaks for mechanical reasons. It would be easy to forgive if the poor context introduced an interesting scenario. But as we've established, there is no decision-making process here, so the watering can breaks, even though it makes no sense, seemingly just to waste your time. More irritating is the fact that there's already an inbuilt context to limit a watering can's use. Watering cans have to be refilled. I suspect the watering can's limited durability probably contributed to the game's invincible flowers. It would be an enormous headache to keep your flowers alive if your watering can had limited uses. All of this is tedious enough on its own, but what makes it a real headache is that your inventory completely lacks any kind of smart streamlining features. If you're as anal as I am, you like your pockets to be neat and tidy, but every time a tool breaks, it's removed from your pocket, meaning that any other item you pick up, including the crafting materials needed to make a new one, will fill in that spot. Tools taking up pocket space has always been a small irritant to me in this series. I can't imagine a situation where I wouldn't prefer to keep my tools on me at all times, so those first slots are almost always going to be taken up by my tools anyway. The game now has 8 tools you need to keep in regular rotation, including the ladder and vaulting pole, and I think some kind of tool belt is essential at this point to keep it all organised, especially when your tools keep breaking and muddling everything up. It feels strange to bring Nook and Orville into this criticism, but the UI is pretty abysmal overall. The dialogue and menus are bloated and difficult to navigate. Tom Nook's "What should I do" option, intended to nudge new players in the right direction, becomes irrelevant for the majority of the playtime as he doesn't have a good answer for you past a certain point. His answer basically becomes "do whatever you like," stretched out to 3 or so text boxes. Ask to demolish a structure, and Nook will swap the affirmative response and put the negative response at the top, presumably to stop players from accidentally text skipping through a high commitment option. All it really does though is confuse the player, as in every other circumstance, affirmative is at the top. There's no way that that isn't going to confuse everybody. I can imagine at least a few players changing their mind halfway through and accidentally selecting the wrong option and confirming the decision. Orville's text boxes are really compartmentalised, requiring you to select multiple options to make the simplest decisions. I suspect this is a byproduct of New Horizons' determination to keep only a limited number of text options on screen at once. Having fewer options might sound more streamlined or intelligible, but in practice it's massively more clunky and time consuming than just offering you every option of the dialogue tree up front. Sending items through the mail is a similar pain in the arse. Even after sending plenty of cards, it'll still bring up a text box telling you, "looks like you can send a card." Oh, does it aye? Can you send a card? Unbelievable. The game suggests that it's connecting to the internet individually for each letter sent, which is either a bit of a misleading text box or is horribly inefficient. And even after all these text boxes, the game still doesn't let you know that you can only send 2 cards per recipient per day. I understand them wanting to prevent griefing through spam, but surely that limit could be removed for best friends, or even just raised a little. There are a number of other UI issues, so let's go through them rapid fire. It's impossible to eat multiple fruit at once. Drop is above use on consumables. Some vendors force you to buy items individually. Those same vendors often meticulously play the animation of money changing hands, then the item changing hands. It's impossible to craft using materials from storage even indoors. There's no way to unequip tools indoors. There's no way to select multiple items in either pockets or storage at once. There's no way to craft multiple items at once. There's no way to buy multiple tops or bottoms at once from the Able Sisters' dressing room, and there's no way to send items purchased from the dressing room straight into the pockets. I left a wardrobe outside the shop specifically for this purpose, cutting down on time wasted if I wanted to send someone else some clothes. You're also unable to climb cliffs or cross rivers without manually equipping the respective tool. The vaulting pole and the ladder are completely useless outside of a single dedicated purpose, so context-sensitive actions, such as pressing A next to a river with no tool equipped, could completely eliminate this visit to the menu. Now, Animal Crossing, to an extent, has always been about tedious busy work, but navigating its menu, despite being tedious busy work itself, is not itself the gameplay. It's instead a vector for gameplay options. They're a necessary evil here, not a core feature, and should aim to get out of the way as quickly as possible. There is nothing productive or satisfying about navigating a bloated UI. Rolled up in that complaint is the related complaint that the dialogue is terribly repetitive. Characters like Orville, Timmy and Tommy, and Mabel Able are going to be talked to on an extremely regular, probably daily basis. As these characters are there to serve a function beyond socialising, they're more rigid than the villagers. They won't respond to clothing, furniture, or events with appropriate dialogue. And so every day that you play this game, you're going to be reading the same dialogue from these characters, day in, day out, again and again and again. I understand why it's necessary, but it doesn't stop it from getting old. There are some considerations in New Horizons. Enter Nook's cranny or the Able Sisters multiple times in a single day, and they'll greet you with unobtrusive floating text bubbles. I'd really have liked to have seen more of this kind of deftness, because you'll still need to sit through the same dialogue every time you make a selection, or choose to sell something, or walk into the changing room. Talk to Orville with a Nook Miles ticket, and he'll waste a text box reminding you that you have a Nook Miles ticket. Try to sell something to Timmy and Tommy on a Sunday, and they'll remind you, no matter how long you've been playing, that they're not accepting turnips today. Isabelle is particularly obnoxious in this game. Her chipper attitude and useful mechanical role, alongside the fact that 90% of people online are sexual deviants, quickly made her a fan favourite after her introduction in New Leaf. In New Horizons, she has a comparatively minor role as the player can place furniture outside by themselves. So, presumably to give her more screen time and capitalise on her popularity, Isabelle will interrupt the player with an announcement at the beginning of each new day. But important events are so scarce that the player is instead often subjected to a chat about her television habits. Charming the first few times perhaps, but after a month's worth of play it becomes extremely tiresome to be subjected to the same jokes every single day. This kind of disruptive mechanical role only makes me resent Isabelle. Sable suffers from a similar problem. Getting her to come out of her shell was always one of my favourite bits of previous games, overcoming a literal hedgehog's dilemma. But once you become close with her, her dialogue becomes rote and uninteresting as she only comments on the season or the day of the week. Speaking to her now is just a formality. Upholding the grand Nintendo tradition of owls who never shut up, Blathers is the absolute king of aggravating and redundant dialogue, I'm sorry to say. The joke is, of course, that Blathers tends to blether on, and I can't really criticise that character trait without becoming something of a hypocrite. But I must say, it makes trips to the museum an absolute chore. The first time I surprised Blathers by waking him up during the day, it was a charming little joke. 15 years on, and the gag has worn thin to say the least. I wonder just how much time I've wasted having this joke shown to me by now. Menu usage is doubled with Blathers as the player has to appraise and donate fossils separately. In the first Animal Crossing, the player would have to send fossils away in the post to be appraised, and then wait 3 days for their return before donating them to the museum. Removing this was one of the series' earliest streamlining efforts, and yet 4 games and almost 20 years later, the player still has to text skip through Blather's interminable and repetitive dialogue to get the fossils appraised before donating them. Try to donate a fossil before appraisal, and Blathers will refuse it until you specifically ask him to appraise it first. Once you do, Blathers behaves as if he'd never seen the fossil before in his life. What do you mean you've never seen such a well-preserved brachiotail, you muppet? You've literally just inspected it! It's like you're having 2 separate conversations, and New Horizons makes no attempt to bridge that gap. Blathers isn't a complete disaster by any means. Present him with a new fossil, fish, insect or painting, and he'll give you a short lecture on it in a lovely little example of intrinsic learning. This is where Blather's personality marries itself with a useful feature. The short presentations are charming and informative. I know I've slagged him off here, but I do like Blathers, so much so that I wish I could just give him any duplicate fossils for his own personal collection. Although he seems to live in the museum, so maybe there's not much point. I just wish that he wasn't a vector for the game to waste so much of your time. I feel obliged to make a daily visit to the museum. I just wish it didn't feel like a chore. Worse than any of these though are Gulliver and Wisp. They show up on your island every so often and demand you recover 5 items that they've carelessly scattered around the place to get a prize. Again, the first time Gulliver washes up on the beach, it's charming, but the 10th time, it's frustrating because you know at this point that you're going to have to spend the next few minutes beachcombing. Yes, the furniture you get for this is pretty unique, but the reward isn't as important to me as the actual experience of playing, and digging holes all over the beach just to put this communicator back together is so tedious. For a character that's so full of life and stories, for a character that's so charming, Gulliver is married to the most mind-numbingly boring gameplay. Calamity struck today when I realised that if I put the Able Sisters' shop on the right as I had initially planned, the cliff would block the light coming into their window. Yes, I know they aren't real, yes, I know this doesn't matter, but the whole point of customising your island is aesthetics, and having the cliff so close to a window wasn't aesthetically pleasing, alright? What are you going to do, comment about it? Unfortunately, it was around this time Nook's protégés decided they were going to upgrade the store. This meant that I was unable to move the building until they had finished upgrading, leaving me to wait a few days to resolve this issue. Now, that was an inconvenience for me, of course, but am I allowed to criticise that? That's not a rhetorical question, I'm being serious. Is it fair of me to criticise that? This was undoubtedly a negative experience. I remember sighing and rolling my eyes when I realised my mistake. But at what point is that the game's fault, and at what point does that stop being the game's fault and start being my fault? Is my negative experience with this part of the game an example of a shortcoming, or is it just my playstyle being slightly incompatible with the game's intended experience? Basically, is the game punishing my lack of foresight on my own terms bad game design? Or is it actually extremely good game design that it allowed me to define my own terms at all? With a small change in perspective, this frustration becomes entirely my own fault. And while I could just say that rather than subject you to my thought process, that statement has pretty heavy implications, because it's difficult to look at things even slightly objectively. I originally noted that down as a criticism, and now here I am, realising the fact that I could actually make that mistake at all is emblematic of the game's quality. I'm not going to go too much further with that, lest I start pontificating about what it means to criticise at all. This video's been galaxy-brained enough as it is. But I think it's worth making clear that you probably shouldn't take any of my comments here, or in any of my videos, as an authoritative stance. They're all based on my subjective experiences with the game, where I think it fell short, and how I think the experience would have been improved for me. I've gone wrong before, overstepping marks or misunderstanding features, and I'm probably going to do so again. I've probably done so in this very video even. But well. Hopefully it's insightful or useful to somebody, even if it's just to show how a player can potentially misinterpret a positive feature and have a negative experience, and how that's maybe not a bad thing. Nook's store being closed locks away a number of essential features. The general daily routine in Animal Crossing goes something like this. You gather items, you sell them to make money, then you spend that money. Having Nook's store be closed breaks that loop, leaving you unable to sell anything. Selling unwanted items is a huge part of Animal Crossing's daily cycle, and ties into almost all of the other mechanics. Catching bugs or fish, gathering fossils, and even talking to the villagers, who will often reward you with items that you may not want. Selling is also the only way to make substantial money, meaning you can't spend the day working towards other goals like paying off your mortgage. It's such an essential part of the game that you'd be as well not playing on days that the store is closed. What's strange is New Horizons has already faced this problem down and come up with an elegant solution. In previous games, there was little point playing at night as the store was closed, so New Horizons introduces a drop-off box allowing you to clear your pockets and make a little extra cash during the night. The greater flexibility is welcome. If I need to unwind, I can spend an hour catching fish no matter what time it is. I'm not sure why the items couldn't go for full price rather than 80%, I can't see that breaking the game, but it's still great as a receptacle for disposing of surplus that you don't need. The drop-off box would have been the perfect catch-all solution when the shop is closed, but it's inaccessible while the store is being renovated. Your inventory becomes an issue on days like today. Without Nook's Cranny, there's no way to clear it out without leaving litter all over the ground. I was fortunate in that CJ was in town, allowing me to at least sell fish, but my pockets still ended up really cluttered by the time I was ready to stop. Imagine how much worse it would have been if CJ hadn't been around. Taking away the player's ability to sell things doesn't challenge the player or encourage them to play differently, it just removes a core part of the game and leaves it feeling empty. On days when the shop's being upgraded, I tend to get bored far quicker and play for a lot less time. Nook's Cranny's first upgrade becomes its only upgrade, contrasting with previous games where it would usually have a couple more. This seems like an objective downgrade to previous games, giving the player less of a daily selection. But New Horizons' new priorities needs to be considered. The game has more of a focus on crafting your own items, as well as trading with friends, and having the shop remain relatively small means it doesn't eclipse these mechanics. It also means that the tropical island feel isn't subverted by an opulent shopping centre. While I understand the disappointment, this was absolutely the right decision in my opinion. Animal Crossing New Horizons saw its first major update today, adding characters like Leaf and Jolly Red. This presents an interesting wrinkle to reviewing the game. It's possible that this video will become outdated even upon the day of its release. In the time it's taken me to make this, the game has been updated further to add more features. Thankfully, the updates haven't altered the fabric of the game too much so far, but it's conceivable, if not extremely likely, that this video will eventually be describing a version of the game that no longer exists in any form. It's already happened a little bit. Swimming and dreaming are features that I won't be covering. At some point, you have to stop chasing a car you're never going to catch, but even with the best of intentions, this video isn't going to be timeless. The drip feed of content is the right choice for this game, as it allows players to time travel without allowing them to spoil seasonal events or unlock all of the game's content at a faster pace than the rest of the world, leaving some surprises for everyone. It also encourages lapsed players to come back to the game when these new updates do release. I often yearn for a simpler time because I'm an old man now, but this is one point where I find this newfangled technology quite agreeable. That's right, I'm doing the out-of-touch old comedy grandpa routine. #Animal Crossing, fuck me. On the day I discovered the museum lacked a section for paintings and statues, I breathed a sigh of relief. Crazy Red, known as Jolly Red in this game, has always been one of my least favourite parts of the series. So, as you can imagine, I was dismayed to learn he'd be returning in the game's first major update. The character himself is fun. He's such an obvious huckster, and yet he's so full of it that he even manages to swindle himself. He'll sometimes sell genuine, valuable art believing it to be a fake. It's always a delight when a game can express a character through its mechanics. But gathering all these items is such a protracted process that it puts me off ever bothering to collect them. Purchasing a piece of art locks the player out of buying any of the rest of them for practically no reason. So unlike every other museum piece, to collect art the player has to forego other options when making their decision. Choose a genuine piece of art, and you are also choosing not to take any of the other ones. And there's no way of knowing when that piece of art is going to show up again. Due to the infrequency of Red's visits, new pieces of art can only be collected once every couple of weeks or so, meaning that progress can only be made sporadically. Having Red show up with all fakes is extremely frustrating when it means losing a couple of weeks worth of potential progress in the form of a single painting. In past games, besides New Leaf, there was no way to tell whether or not a piece was genuine, and New Horizons improves that arrangement tremendously by having identifiable differences between real and fake art. But while some examples are incredibly obvious, like a coffee stain on the Vitruvian Man, others are a lot more subtle. I would have had no idea that Giuseppe Arcimboldo's Summer was missing a flower on its chest without looking up a guide. It's possible that's just my ignorance showing, but there's no reason to expect every player to have an intimate knowledge of every art piece featured in the game, especially when a large contingent of players will be children. So unless you're intimately familiar with the original, the only way to know which items are real and which are fake is to stop what you're doing and look up a guide. You're reduced to guesswork if you don't have the internet or a particularly chunky encyclopedia handy. The paintings aren't even given their real name until they're displayed in the museum, meaning that players aren't likely to find out more about the painting themselves, and instead will only learn the euphemistic name Animal Crossing gives them in order to solve the puzzle. I love the idea as it could be an effective and unobtrusive way of teaching people about art, but the game frames this lesson as an extrinsic interruption, making me more resentful and less willing to learn. The intrinsic learning happens afterwards. Once the item is in the museum, the game will name the title and the artist alongside a short description. This is backwards. This information should come before the player has made a choice, testing them on what they've learned by having them discern the real art from the fake. It could easily be done by allowing the player to reference an app on their phone, or by talking to Blathers about it. The fact that Blathers never asks where the player gets the art makes him seem even more lifeless. You would expect him to be more invested in getting these rare and valuable pieces out of the hands of a conman. Wolfgang, you dirty bastard, what are these tissues for? The very existence of an easily accessible multiplayer option fundamentally alters the fabric of the game and the player's priorities. New Horizons locks each island's stores to a specific colour of item. Allowing players to customise their own built furniture, but not store-bought, seemed like a strange limitation at first, but it's effective in encouraging players to get online and get trading without locking them out of furniture entirely. It's similar to the way fruit has always worked in the series. Players get a single native fruit that can be traded with or given to other players. So there are material benefits for interacting with others, but players aren't punished too harshly if they can't for whatever reason. For instance, if they live in a remote area with a poor network connection. I really wanted a red phone booth for my town, but the only kind I could order from my catalogue was green. So I sent out a call on Twitter, and was thankfully able to trade at Cherry Seeds for the mint-coloured portable toilet they were looking for. Being able to talk with another person and work out a satisfying arrangement for both of us was one of my favourite memories with this game. Its systems enabled a positive and productive interaction with a stranger that benefited us both. For me, having this kind of interaction with another human being is a lot more valuable than having a similar interaction with an NPC. Interactions with a real person are obviously a lot more nuanced, and completing the transaction meant I got the satisfaction of obtaining the item I wanted, on top of the satisfaction of knowing I helped someone else get what they wanted. I couldn't tell you why that feels good, that's maybe a job for a psychologist, but it ended up being a delightful exchange. And this kind of interaction is more likely to happen in New Horizons thanks to some additional considerations. The best friend system allows players to decide which visitors get to use destructive tools on their island. Digging up items or chopping down trees has permanent consequences, and the best friends list lets the player choose whom they trust with that power. Thanks to this system, even the most determined troll will only manage, at most, to take the heads off someone's flowers, which will regrow after a couple of days anyway. Nintendo are finally getting into the spirit of online play with strangers, but are still taking care to incorporate that safely into their existing systems. So while there are definite positives, the ubiquity of online play has altered the feel of the series significantly. In older games, it was a rare and kind of special experience to visit someone else's town. The online functions were limited or non-existent, and the series didn't have enough of an install base for other players to be commonplace. My only online experience in Wild World was visiting someone from the UK Nintendo forums, and then getting kicked out the second they learned I was Scottish. But multiplayer is baked into New Horizons on a foundational level. It's even implicit in the increased focus on self-expression. It's a given that most players will be able to get online and share their creations. Nintendo even charge for the privilege. Along with the Switch's built-in share button allowing players to upload funny screenshots and videos to social media, seeing another's town is now extremely common. You're doing it right now. Unless you're one of those folks that just sticks on YouTube videos in the background while you're drawing or doing the dishes or something, in which case, solidarity, my friend. Having a large online community playing and discussing and dissecting the game all at once is obviously a good thing, especially for Nintendo's bottom line. These kinds of social games do their own marketing. But it also demystifies the game and a lot of its systems. Like it or not, if you're involved with the online community, people like me are going to batter you with facts about the game that might be more fun not to know. Maybe if you manage to avoid in-depth mechanical breakdowns explaining how to perfectly arrange your flowers for breeding, and if you don't see advertisements for Raymond quote-unquote in boxes, and maybe if you don't meet doppelgangers of animals from your town in your friend's town who pretend not to recognise you, you'll have a cosier time with your own personal little slice of island life. But for me, having a lot of online friends playing at the same time completely changed the atmosphere. My town didn't feel quite so much like a sleepy little town tucked away in my own idyllic little corner of the world anymore. This, of course, isn't a problem inherent to the game, it's just the pace life moves at online. But man, it's difficult not to yearn for that simpler time when playing Animal Crossing didn't feel pressured into being a performative act. Maybe that's something I ought to keep in mind the next time one comes out. Despite the fact that you now need to pay an annual fee to access them, the online systems in New Horizons are embarrassingly clunky. Even once the player has made it through Orville's interminable menus, every player on the island they're visiting has to sit through a minute-long interruption while a character arrives. If a player is in the middle of a conversation, the game will continue flashing an announcement that they need to end the conversation. I was invited to my partner Nanadokin's island along with a few friends to watch the meteor shower, and the game made it a complete chore for everyone involved by stopping everything on the island whenever someone arrived or departed. Every conversation carried with it the risk of delaying someone's arrival or departure. The punchline, for me, came when I was stuck waiting for the game to finish indulging the joke that, like her brother, Celeste likes to prattle on a bit, while simultaneously shouting at me to end the conversation. I assume the cutscene is disguising technical necessities, there's no question in my mind that it would have been avoided if at all possible. But it's still frustrating for every player to have to sit through an interruption of that length every time someone arrives, especially when someone has trouble connecting so everyone just gets booted off the island. Having guests over also locks the player out of setting or moving any furniture, or terraforming the island. Most of the gameplay is about self-expression through creation, but inviting a friend over locks you out of the majority of those options. This is why the online play still feels so underwhelming. Playing with friends and playing with the creative mechanics that make up the bulk of the game are mutually exclusive. Kids nowadays will most likely have grown up creating complex projects together in Minecraft, and even as someone who never really got into Minecraft, it's difficult not to be disappointed by New Horizons' limitations. Of course, adding terraforming and moving furniture to online play would come with a host of complications that would need to be overcome. I don't say any of this lightly, but overall, when I think about my online experiences I've had with my PS4 and especially my PC, I feel Nintendo need much better online features and infrastructure to justify charging for it. While the online encourages interaction with the player base more than ever before, the game also allows for pretty large imbalances between players through its extremely lenient stance on resetting and time travel. I thought that an iron bridge would look nice over this river, but after some deliberation I decided that was a mistake. Rather than wait another day, I decided to just reset and redo some of the day's work. Resetting the game without saving used to incur a pretty hilarious penalty. A crotchety mole named Rossetti would burst from the ground and give you a lengthy telling off that would only get more hurtful and elaborate the more you inspired his wrath. Rossetti has had less and less of a presence as the series has progressed, apparently because Nintendo got feedback that his aggressive, authoritative tone would make Japanese children cry. Personally, I miss Mr. Rossetti. I thought he was a brilliant way of discouraging exploitative playstyles, but if he actually upset kids, then I can see why New Horizons would want to tone him down. Rossetti's absence, at least in his traditional role, is perhaps a decision bundled up in a new save system. While the player can save and quit whenever they want, the game will automatically save at regular intervals. The Switch's infrastructure practically demands a more streamlined approach to saving than the series has historically employed. The Switch prioritises easy access to games and apps whenever the player wants, to the point that the console very rarely needs to be turned off completely. Suspending the software and sending the console to sleep is pretty much the default way to stop playing now. Forcing the player to save and quit Animal Crossing completely would be incongruous with the console's overall philosophy of quick and easy access to games and apps, so I can see why Rossetti would have been a more complicated proposition on this new hardware. But whatever the reason, the lack of any consequences emboldened me to take a bit of a shortcut here. So long as you can do so before an autosave, there's no incentive not to reset if you make a mistake. It's perhaps strange that the game is so lenient on resetting, as this is the kindest Animal Crossing yet. The series is right at home on the Switch, with the console's portability and robust sleep and suspend features making it easier than ever to make time for it. After completing my recording, I found myself plugging away at it for a wee 5 minutes here and there, watering some flowers, checking the shop, and then just hitting the sleep button and getting back to work. The game can also be downloaded digitally, meaning that you don't even need to switch carts to keep up with your town. In retrospect, I kind of wish I'd chosen the digital option myself, but it was a gift, so I'm not about to complain. Time travel is barely disincentivised either. As with previous games in the series, the player can change the date and time on the console to change the date and time in-game as well. Real-time events will behave as if that time had passed normally, meaning turnips will rot and weeds will grow, but otherwise there's nothing to stop you from making time your plaything. It's something I never had cause to do personally. I had enough to do each day with all the terraforming that I never felt starved for content. Let's call a spade a spade. These are exploits. They are literally exploiting the game's mechanics to circumvent some of its design decisions. But that's only a problem if you consider these exploits to be playing in bad faith. Without a competitive aspect to the multiplayer, I don't really think resetting and time travelling are a problem. Rhetorically, I might be tempted to muse about the developers' opinions and wonder if time travel is subverting the intended experience. But if anything, they are even more lenient. They don't consider time travel cheating at all. I've said before that there's a greater focus on player expression and less of a focus on randomly generated daily content in the game. Taking that into account, this laissez-faire attitude towards potential exploits works perfectly within the game's themes and intended design. So I have no beef with exploits at all, but it's such a strange attitude for a series that was practically defined at the beginning by being bold enough to resist players that played fast and loose. Personally, I think the game is more interesting to play as intended. Like I said at the beginning, the idea of a game that demands you pay attention to it every day is just too petulant for me to resist. But I understand that not everybody has the same priorities as me. I described New Horizons as the kindest Animal Crossing yet there, and I don't just mean mechanically. Rossetti wasn't the only character from the series past to rub players the wrong way. Tom Nook earned himself a bit of a reputation as a tyrant in previous games, but here he's squat and plush and ever so friendly. I don't think I've ever even seen him with an angry expression in New Horizons. A lot has been made of the change in attitude, but even while I prefer the series with a bit of bite, it has to be stressed that this friendlier Animal Crossing doesn't feel unconsidered. We all know the meme, Tom Nook is a heartless loan shark that only cares about profits, and so on and so forth for about 20 odd years. The meme was never that accurate. Even at his worst, Nook would give you an interest-free loan with no time limit to repay him, and a job to start paying it off. Nook isn't a loan shark, Animal Crossing's just capitalist propaganda. And to the person already typing a comment, I'm joking, calm down. Like, fuck me guys, Pokemon should have had a communist revolution is not a sincerely held belief. New Horizons director Aya Kyogoku's comments on Nook are incredibly insightful. Nook was always envisioned as a good guy, but he never got the chance to express that because the only time the player ever needed to talk to him was when they were conducting business. Mechanically, he was all about money, and that bled into players' interpretations of his character. That's a spot-on observation that I don't think I ever would have picked up on. Even through all my criticisms, I have nothing but respect for these developers. Instead, Nook is associated with another currency in New Horizons, Nook Miles. Nook Miles drive player engagement, rewarding the player for catching fish and bugs, chopping down trees and planting new ones, buying and selling items, talking to their villagers, planting flowers, donating fossils, crafting items, and pretty much anything else you can think of. It creates a more compulsive experience by ensuring that the player's to-do list is never complete. It also gives certain items more value. In an interview, Hyogoku used the example of a common butterfly. Nook Miles can give common butterflies, bugs that are usually more trouble than they're worth to catch, more value by asking you to catch one. Getting into the rhythm of grinding Nook Miles turns New Horizons into a much more mindless, relaxing experience. It's really nice to just have miniature quests beamed directly to your phone to complete if you're in the right mood for it. This kind of mindlessness marries itself well to Animal Crossing's existing pacing and mechanics. But I think a problem worth addressing is how this system further marginalises the villagers. In the older titles, if the game wanted you to engage with fishing or bug catching or talk to villagers, it would do so by bringing it up in conversation with one of the other villagers. Maybe they would ask you to track down a specific fish, or ask you to deliver an item to someone else in your town. So what's the difference between that and the Nook Miles app? Having villagers give out tasks meant they remained a focus as they would always be a major source of gameplay. Talking to a villager was more valuable because there was the possibility that they might give you another little chore to do. Nook Miles, by contrast, are so nakedly compulsive because they're completely divorced from any context. A task shows up on your phone apropos of nothing, and that's it. It's such a brazen way of getting you to engage with the mechanics. It's the kind of abstraction that New Horizons does its best to avoid with the rest of the game. Doing a favour for your neighbour was a simple way of framing these tasks in a universally intelligible way. I guess they feel confident that phone apps are just as universally intelligible nowadays, which is probably true, but it isn't called phone crossing, is it? While involving the villagers more makes sense on paper, I have to admit that having a constant stream of tasks makes the game more compulsive. And thinking about it like that also makes me suspicious, because I probably wouldn't have ended up doing so many chores if the framing device was different. The Nook Miles UI always has 5 tasks along the top bar, and completing one will immediately replace it with another task. The way this is framed means that the player can never find closure using this system. Their to-do list will replenish indefinitely. Imagining that the same tasks were handed out by the villagers, once the task was complete, there would be both closure and a gap between chores that would heighten the risk of the player finding a decent stopping point. Ooh, don't like what that sentence implies. Nook Miles feel like a currency system intended for a different game. One with microtransactions or adverts where every second spent playing means more revenue. I'm not accusing the game of impropriety here, there are no built-in microtransactions. But I'm suspicious of this kind of laser focus on compulsive mechanics because it feels kinda like it's tricking you into playing. It isn't increasing playtime by engaging you emotionally, but by replenishing tasks as quickly as you can complete them with the promise of more numbers going up every time you do. A Mobius loop of the most basic kind of positive feedback. The satisfaction of earning more Nook Miles has a very short half-life as there are always more miles to be earned, and the more miles you earn, the more miles it takes for earning them to be noticeable. Thankfully I have a bit more self-control now, but I know from experience that if you let this kind of system get its hooks in you, it can have a harmful effect on your physical and mental health. I'm not trying to be sensationalist here, but to try and illustrate my mixed feelings on Nook Miles. Because moment to moment, I was having a good time. I found having an endless stream of anonymous tasks to be very relaxing under the right circumstances. But retrospectively, I recognise some design practices in there that make me wary. If you could find a way to keep the compulsive stream of content while also offering some downtime for the player to stop and take a break, you'd have a system that I'd have fewer reservations about. Oh god, here's me arguing that a Nintendo game should have breakpoints. What have I become? Nook Miles are most commonly spent on Nook Miles tickets, which allow you to go on a mystery tour. It's a really cool concept, but I learned how limited they were disappointingly fast. Nook Miles tickets can be exchanged at Dodo Airlines to travel to a randomly generated island that you can never return to. In principle, I love these, as they allow a single player to get some of the benefits of multiplayer, giving them a chance to meet new villagers and pick up some loot, fossils, and gathering materials. It's also nice to leave a mess with no lasting consequence. Dig up the whole place if you want to, who's going to complain? When I first heard about this feature, I was incredibly excited. I anticipated an end to the daily drought of content. I could play on these new islands as long as I wanted, gathering unique fauna and flora and finding new fossils on every island. But if you haven't played the game, then that description will only set you up for disappointment. In reality, the islands aren't truly randomly generated, they're pre-selected from a small pool with randomly placed trees, rocks and flowers. It doesn't take you long for you to see all the layouts the game has to offer. The loot leaves a lot to be desired as well. The game won't spawn flowers, insects or fish that you can't already collect on your island, and it will only spawn your native fruit and one other kind. Additionally, once you have 10 villagers on your island, the game will stop spawning them on mystery islands. Presumably then, these islands are mainly intended to allow the player to gather more resources like wood and stone if they've exhausted their supply on their main island. And god, isn't that the most milquetoast use of that idea? As time goes on, these islands become less and less useful as the player amasses a healthy supply of rocks and wood. This feature has a ton of potential beyond just allowing the player to gather more resources, and it's a real shame that wasn't capitalised on. While it's a bit of a grind to get Nook Miles, it's a massive grind to get all the cash you need. New Horizons takes an insane amount of money to get the most out of. As if to demonstrate my point, I'm flat broke. It's almost like I'm editing this after the fact. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I haven't been playing particularly efficiently, but I don't think anyone will deny that it takes a lot of dosh to create your perfect town. You have to fund the bridges, inclines, furniture, and building relocations pretty much single-handedly. It's rather a large time investment to make bells. Whether or not you choose to front load that is up to you. You can either grind out your money to get your perfect town as quickly as possible, or take your time and split up the workload over multiple days. I'm in the extremely fortunate position of having the time to play this for multiple hours a day, so that's what I did. I said fortunate position there, but that was a cry for help. Please, for the love of God, somebody hire me. As you can tell from this video, I'm really responsible with money. So to reclaim my fortune, I'm off tarantula hunting. Each time the player uses a Nook Miles ticket, they have a 2% chance of ending up on an island the fans have dubbed Tarantula Island, which might sound like a nightmare, but is actually a godsend. Each tarantula will sell for 8,000 bells, 12,000 if sold to a special NPC, so filling your pockets is guaranteed to net you at least 312,000 bells. This is the most efficient way to make money in the game, but you have to be extraordinarily lucky to get it. But there is a way to force an artificial tarantula island into existence. By smashing rocks, cutting trees, digging up stumps and picking flowers, the player limits the insects the game can spawn to a small handful. Tiger beetles, wharf roaches, giant water bugs and, of course, tarantulas. I don't think it's quite a 1 in 4 chance, but the chance of finding a tarantula using this trick is massively increased. But while it's good for your wallet, Tarantula Island will drain the soul out of you. I'm honestly a little upset that I got to write a sentence as cool as that, and this is the context. Performing this strategy is not a fun way to play the game. It involves painstakingly stripping the island bare, and then walking back and forth for minutes at a time, all the while chasing away or catching the other bugs until you finally spot a tarantula. Then rinse and repeat 40 or so times, assuming that you never once whiff your swing and get stung. There's practically no penalty for that, but the damn thing takes so long as it is that wasting yet more time is yet more frustrating. None of this is helped by your tools breaking all the time. This is ameliorated somewhat by the fact that there are usually trees and rocks around to craft new ones, but more than once I've ended up on an island filled with bamboo, and been unable to gather the necessary materials to craft more tools once they broke. Sure, you can buy new tools from Wilbur, but the axe you can get cannot chop down trees unless you have some ore handy to upgrade it. Remember, to make a Tarantula Island, you have to clear the whole island. It feels kind of unfair to be critiquing the gameplay of what is essentially an exploit, but creating a Tarantula Island is such a dominant strategy that it became something of a phenomenon, the de facto way to play for many. And I don't think it would have become so popular were it not for the fact that the player's options for making money quickly are fairly limited. The player has to spend more money than ever before on furniture and structures, but there are pretty much only 2 ways of getting that money within a reasonable time frame, and one of them requires a fairly hefty investment in the first place. Paying frequent visits to a Tarantula Island feels almost essential when you're getting started, and I don't think it should. Fortunately, in what economists are describing as a turnip for the books, I didn't have to gather many tarantulas before I got lucky in the stock market. The stock market, you know, like stock because they're root vegetables, is the second method of making money in a reasonable time frame, and is absolutely the best way to make money, period. It's a heavily simplified version of the stock market in real life. You buy turnips low on a Sunday morning and try to sell high for the rest of the week. On Sunday morning, your extant turnips will rot, meaning you have to make a profit by Saturday afternoon or you'll make a loss. It's a nail-biting system that sees you weighing up risk and reward to make massive profits. But it's undercut somewhat by how connected the New Horizons community is. The more pals you have, the more likely it is that somebody you know is going to get decent turnip prices, minimising the risk so as to be practically non-existent. In fact, there are entire communities out there dedicated to connecting those with good prices and those with pockets heaving with turnips. There are even third-party price calculators online that are astonishingly accurate. Participation feels almost mandatory, or at least so effective that there's no reason not to. With a little bit of time investment, you can turn insane profits. I'm not convinced this is a bad thing though. If it is the only way to make the money you need, like I say, then surely the fact that it's in the game and more accessible than ever is a well thought through change. There's an exhilarated relief when you're scrambling to your mate's island to sell your stash and make big cash. Alone, it's kind of a muted experience. You buy the turnips, then you either get lucky or you don't. But meeting your pals and your pals' pals on their island for a big Neep jamboree is fun. Plus, it's an opportunity to be a good sport when you get good prices. Today we found out that my good pal Stew's Neeps were selling for 536 bells a piece. The only problem is, we discovered this at about 11:40, 20 minutes before the prices rolled over. And let me tell you, when you're on a timer, it becomes glaringly obvious just how much time the game is willing to waste, especially online. That was the most stressed I've been at a game in ages. Turnip prices change twice every day, once when the store opens at 8 AM and once at noon. The morning prices will last for 4 hours and the afternoon prices for 10. So it takes some dedication to really make the most of this system. You really have to shove Animal Crossing into your schedule. If this really is intended to be friendlier to accommodate the game's increased costs, maybe having the price change happen later in the day at 3 PM would allow more people to make the most of it. After my tidy success in New Horizons, I went and bought some shares in Oxo. I'm really getting into the stock market. Animal Crossing has always taken an interesting approach to its music, playing specific tunes at specific hours every day. I think this soundtrack is cracking. I don't think anything will top the original for me, but it's a close second favourite. I like it so much that I'd really have liked to have heard more of it. Songs playing at specific hours allows the music to create a mood depending on the time. Obviously that's the right decision. It would be sorta weird if the game was playing sleepy, low-key nighttime songs in the middle of the day while the island is full of life. But as Animal Crossing is a game that demands to be played on a schedule, it's likely that a player is going to be playing around the same time every day. I know that in my play sessions, I tended to hear the same songs over and over again, never really getting the chance to hear the music from early in the morning or late in the evening. The soundtrack is great, even 3 AM, and I'd love to be able to hear more of it even if I'm playing with a fairly regular routine. Something as simple as letting the player choose the music using their phone would be ideal. Nintendo have a bit of a reputation for over-tutorialising, patronising the player by explaining again and again the mechanics they've been using fluently for hours. I don't like it, but I've made my peace with that. These are, before all else, children's games, and if I'm really that upset about being talked down to, I should probably play something else. Not to say that the over-tutorialising is good, actually, just that I think Nintendo have made their stance clear by this point. The bit that winds me up though is that even with all the over-explaining, they do a horrible job explaining things. Each town can only have a maximum of 8 inclines and 8 bridges, and Nook only deigned to let me know once I ran up against the limit. Now, I'm assuming that this is unavoidable for some reason, although for the life of me I can't think why. If I want to make a town entirely made of stairs, let me do it, Nintendo, you cowards. But assuming that it is, that information should have been front-loaded. I had plenty more plans, rope bridges across waterfalls, that sort of thing, but with this revelation, I've had to scrap them. Ah well, I suppose I'd better start wrapping this up anyway. You know, this video was supposed to be about 20 minutes long. The whole thing got away from me as something awful. Although mechanically the villagers are rather bland, I want to take some time to praise the dialogue in the localization, which has evidently had a lot of care put into it. One of my favourite examples is Wilbur, who says lifting off November Oscar Whisker. In the NATO phonetic alphabet, the word now would be spelled November Oscar Whiskey. Now, personally, I can't imagine anybody being offended by the idea of whiskey being mentioned in this context, but then I'm fae Scotland. I'm named after a man who got into the liquor cabinet and tanned a bottle of whiskey when he was 3 years old. But regardless, the decision was made to change it, and the localisers happened upon a really cute alternative. Whisker is one letter of whiskey, well, the Irish-American spelling anyway, and has a strong association with animals. It's the perfect child-friendly substitute. Another lovely little detail can be found in the clothing. You'll notice there are no leather garments in the game. All of the clothes that would be leather are instead pleather, a contraction of plastic leather, a fake leather substitute. This was presumably done to avoid letting the player befriend cows while wearing another cow's hide, but it's important to note that they didn't have to go to that effort. Animal Crossing already plays fast and loose with visual consistency. I can imagine it would have been fairly easy to overlook leather, but they didn't, and I think it's worth drawing attention to that attention to detail. Maybe one of them can have a look over that last sentence for me. Animal Crossing is not, of course, realistic, nor is it aiming for realism. However, there are a number of details that aim to emulate reality, to give the player the impression that the area they're playing in is a real place. New Horizons is packed with detail which perhaps seems unnecessary at first, but is all beneficial to creating an air of reality. Trees, despite being very cartoony, will rustle in the breeze. The player will need to dislodge earth with their shovel before terraforming. Placing fans next to a clothes horse will cause the washing to sway, and shadows will slide across the landscape depending on the time of day. There's a dedication to detail that makes the world feel alive even while we accept it isn't real. But these details sometimes threaten to upset the balance between reality and this unreal world. You can find anatomically correct human dolls and realistic animals like birds and hamsters. You can also find an evolutionary chart showing how these plush little cuddly toys evolved from realistic fossils. These should invite a lot of questions by highlighting the incongruity between these stylised cartoon bobbleheads and the way we understand the worlds to work in real life. The characters in Animal Crossing are caricatures. They aren't supposed to stipulate enough to require explanation or specifics. We're not supposed to take this world or its inhabitants literally, but the fossil records ask us to do just that. It doesn't delineate the realistic fossils from the cuddly cartoon creatures. In fact, it locates them both on a single timeline. This should, in theory, feel uncanny and invite questions like, how did a creature like Ali evolve? But for some reason, it all ends up working just fine. And that's absolutely fascinating to me because logically, it absolutely shouldn't. Animal Crossing never makes an attempt to establish itself as a real and tangible world, with its visual style deliberately distancing itself from reality by emulating the feel of a miniature diorama. That isn't a criticism, it evokes a mood and a sense of place perfectly well. If anything, it's even improved by the lack of specifics. So when it brings in these kinds of details, that illusion should begin to strain, but for some reason I find it absolutely copacetic with the overall aesthetic. Maybe it's just that we can read these cartoony characters completely separately to the background details. There's no mistaking that the frog you can talk to and the frog you can catch are totally different both functionally and aesthetically. I don't think there's a specific formula for this. Little details can really flesh out even the most unrealistic world, just so long as it isn't so detailed that it becomes uncanny. And New Horizons certainly isn't. Finally, this fence will stop those animals from getting lost in the woods all the bloody time. For fuck's sake. Become good enough friends with your villagers and you can sometimes offer them new catchphrases, little verbal tics that they'll sprinkle into many of their sentences. You can give your residents a personal touch with a bespoke nickname and catchphrase tailored to their characteristics. But these verbal tics have the chance to spread to another villager. Sub touche is fine, if anything I wish that catchphrase would spread further. But my partner told a bird character to say que, like a chocobo from Final Fantasy, and when it caught on and Sylvia the kangaroo started saying que, it didn't really fit. This is also a problem when giving gifts to characters with specific theming. Villagers will often wear the clothes or use the furniture you give them, meaning that unless you're very precious with gifts, you can easily end up making them a visual mess. Genji, for example, has a strong Japanese theme, so giving him sunglasses and a muscle suit for a gift seems a little inconspicuous. If anything, I want villagers to have more agency to make them feel more like characters and less like decorative nodes, and this would seem like a step in the right direction. But stuff like this isn't just a binary slider from character to ornament, it's the sum total of many things. Having these villagers who feel like ornaments most of the time decide for themselves that they're going to choose a completely inappropriate catchphrase or wear inappropriate clothing can be annoying because you're conditioned to see them as decorative up until now. The second they don't behave that way, it clashes with your expectations. Fortunately, you can ask Isabelle to reset them back to default, presumably as a failsafe against griefing, but you might be waiting a while before they ask for another personalised catchphrase, sub to Shay. Judging by her full glass of whisker on the table there, Isabelle evidently has something to celebrate. Today's the day Dunno finally became a 5-star island. That's nice, isn't it? Getting a 5-star island is based on arcane specifics, the number of trees, which can't be too few or too many, the amount of furniture, which can't be too sparse or too cluttered, the amount of flowers, the number of villagers, and more besides. Isabelle will give you tips to nudge you in the right direction without ever drawing too much attention to the specifics of the mechanics, which is absolutely the right decision. If you've got a problem with an area you're living in, it's a gut feeling based on your experiences rather than anything quantifiable. Nobody's going to be sitting there like, well, if there were 7 fewer trees, this neighbourhood might actually be livable. You can't possibly be a Super Saiyan Kakarot. The reward for getting a 5-star town is a lily of the valley spawning on your island. Every day it remains at 5 stars, which is great because it's useless. If you want to give Isabelle the fingers and have a dense, spooky forest island, you're not missing out on much by going for it. I also got a camper visiting today. Campers are villagers that can move into your island permanently, replacing one of your villagers. But like I said earlier, even if I got someone cool, they would just be ornamental. Would I really want to replace one of the villagers I've had for a while? One that I've spent time and energy building a relationship with, just for a trophy? The answer, as it turns out, is yes. Get to fuck, Genji, I never liked you anyway. What? Stitch has always had more wave clear. The method of inviting campers to live in your island permanently is needlessly contrived. Even if they love your town, which of course they will, they're programmed to think the sun shines out your arse, they'll engage you in a game of chance to see if they should move in. If you lose, you can just keep talking to them until they ask you to play again. So the only factor luck plays is how much time you'll have to waste before they move in. Setting the game up this way makes all of the villagers feel even more transient and indecisive than they already do. Basing huge life decisions on a game of chance would be a charming way to characterise villagers as laid back, but it feels inauthentic for someone as self-serious as Anka. It's such a nakedly artificial way of pretending the villagers have agency. They practically show the player the random number generator that'll be making the decision for them. Any alternative, even just them pretending to consider it before saying yes, would have felt far more meaningful, and it would have wasted a lot less time to boot. Once the decision is made, the game will then choose a random villager and tell you that they were thinking of moving out anyway. So long as the game hasn't auto-saved, you can reset it as often as you like until a villager you're not attached to decides to move out. Again, it's a test of not so much luck as patience. The player is also unable to interact with campers on friends' islands, massively complicating what should be an easy process. There have been times that one of my pals wanted a villager in my campsite or vice versa, but in order to give them that villager, I'd have to do the following. Invite that villager into my town and kick out one of my residents, wait until they randomly decide they want to leave, invite my friend back over assuming that they're not busy, and then they can talk to them. It's so needlessly cumbersome. A far more elegant solution would be to have the visitor tell the camper about their island, whereupon the camper will offer to visit the following day. That way, if the host wants to keep the villager, tough luck, but if they don't, at least they could go to a player that does. This would encourage more good faith play and close interaction, rather than the faceless market that's sprung up around certain villagers. The fact that "in boxes" has entered my lexicon sends a shiver down my spine. Speaking of which, exchanging villagers with friends is further limited by the way the game works. If a character is quote unquote in boxes, meaning that they're preparing to leave a town, they can't even come and visit a full island, so there's no way for a player that wants that villager to get them. If you could offer to let them visit your island campsite first, that would be an easy way to remedy this problem. Again, all these limitations do is manipulate the player into buying amiibo cards. You could go ahead and spend hours grinding to get the villager you want, or you could just improve your chances and buy some cards. Sure, Nintendo sell packs rather than specific cards, but someone's going to have to buy a lot of packs so they can jack up the prices on eBay. In the end, most of the money still ends up in Nintendo's pocket. A staple of Animal Crossing since Wild World is the rolling pin world. The horizon will curve exaggeratedly away from you, giving the impression that you're living on an enormous log. The feature was conceived to take advantage of the DS's unique features, leaving the sky on the top screen and allowing the player to tap on villagers in the distance to wave at them. The feature made less and less sense to me as the series went on, and the DS's unique features were lost. I never appreciated it much because of its shortcomings. The warped perspective made the town feel flatter and emptier, and was so abstract as to undermine the sense of place. I always felt like my town existed on a tiny planetoid of some kind. Suffice it to say, I always preferred the cozier top-down view of the first game. Somehow, the rolling pin world has survived long enough to wrap back around to making sense again. Standing on a cliff and looking out to distant land masses totally works as part of the Tropical Island package. It makes perfect sense for a game called New Horizons. The power of an HD console justifies the choice with a more zoomed out camera and some graphical touches designed to enhance the idea that this is a living world. Note the exaggerated depth of field and atmospheric perspective on objects in the distance, and the strong lighting and shadows which establish the time of day and create a sense of place even while you can't see the sky. Perhaps because the ocean creates a sense of distance, this is the first time it feels like a stylistic camera technique rather than your entire world literally existing on a rolling pin. Furthermore, it retains the benefits that it always had, the ability to see animals, objects and buildings from a greater distance without taking the focus away from the player character. New Horizons has firmly convinced me of its benefits, while also giving me the option to use my beloved top-down view whenever I want. Here's me possibly more excited about the camera than anything else in the game. Why do people watch this shite? The slingshot is another DS artifact that I don't think has survived moving away from its native console nearly so well. It clashes hard with the rolling pin world and everything that makes it work. The tool was originally used to take advantage of the dual screen setup. The top screen was dedicated to showing the sky. Presents and UFOs would float across on a 2D plane, making the perspective easy to read, and the slingshot would create a sense of continuity between both screens by letting the player fire stones between them. The single screen setup of every game since make it problematic to use. As every object now exists in the same 3D space, the player needs to awkwardly judge the perspective on exaggerated curved terrain to hit the present flying overhead. The stronger, more realistic lighting also means the present doesn't have a spot shadow, so there's no quick visual reference when crunching this 3D perspective onto a 2D screen. The most damning part is, though, that it's just not fun to use. The slingshot sits in your pockets taking up space until the game decides to spawn a balloon, at which point you take it out, you shoot the present down, then you put it away to be forgotten about for the next 15 minutes. The only interesting scenario possible with this setup is if the balloon spawns in an awkward position, meaning you have to follow it along a cliff or river for a while to shoot it down. But I lied when I said that, that's not so much interesting as it is tedious. After a while, I just stopped bothering. I've spent all this time working on my island, but not much time at all working on my actual house. I'm a bit immobilised designing my house as I'm never quite sure what I want each room to be. Outside, I find it easier to contextualise space and thus decide what I want to put there, but my house is a smaller space and thus needs a greater density of consistent furniture, and I suppose my brain finds it harder to deal with that. That isn't a criticism, by the way. Ultimately, the quality of this system means that I don't really have much to say about it. As I've intoned in the past, I'm not entirely convinced you can divorce inconvenience from satisfaction in a lot of cases. Would I get the same sense of satisfaction from finishing my island if it didn't take me quite so long? Would the game be as much fun with the inconveniences shaved off? If interior decoration is anything to go by, the answer is yes. If anything, it would make the game even more fun and satisfying. Letting the player go into an abstract menu to arrange furniture makes arranging furniture much easier by taking the physical space their avatar must occupy out of the equation. No longer bound by the laws of physical space, you can just teleport a couch to the other side of the room. It's so easy to use, it encourages the player to experiment and try out different arrangements. It's the perfect fit for such an expressive game. There have been criticisms of the narrower range of furniture in this game. The point itself is objectively true. There is less furniture to choose from. But this is one of those decisions where I think trimming the fat to better suit the theme is the right decision. The player has been conditioned to see complete sets as pre-packaged products. In a game with so much focus on handcrafting your own furniture, cutting that range back makes a lot of sense to me. You're encouraged to make your own stuff for at least part of your home. You may have noticed by this point my diverse fashion choices. I made an effort to don a new outfit at the beginning of each day, lest you lot think I'm a smelly bastard. This is another system that I don't have much to say about because it's simply so good. You can coordinate your outfit to the point of literally designing your own garments using a really simple yet solid designer app. If you spot something you like the look of either online or in a friend's town, you can nab it no hassle using the QR code. You can be as creative as you like, or as lazy as you like. For me, having so much freedom to design my own clothing is kinda paralysing. But thankfully for people like me, there's the option to just use the pre-made clothes in different colours. There's still plenty of room to create and coordinate outfits that way, which I really appreciate. Honestly, it's kinda made me want to try diversifying my own fashion in real life. Is there some kind of discount warehouse or something for purple togs? Welcome to Scenic Dunno. I said, welcome to Scenic Dunno, an island of sun, sea, and stitches. Come for the beautiful landmarks like our innovative lighthouse for ants, our decked park, or our beautiful orchard. Here's our resident representative, posing with a gilded watering can for a photo op, no doubt before he shoves it back in a minimum wage labourer's arms once the cameras stop rolling. In the mood for some retail therapy? Come and visit somebody's garden shed, staffed exclusively by children. We're especially proud of the Able Sisters, run by a blue hedgehog. No, it's alright, it's not that one. Here on Dunno, we're big fans of renewable energy, but also love to waste water. In the mood for some leisure? We have fishing. And that's it. Looking to make some new friends? Our friendly residents would be happy to meet you, except for these two arseholes, but I've stuck them up there in the woods out the way. For you adventurous types, we even have a campsite where you can... Ali, where's the visitor? Ali, no! Like I said at the beginning, I didn't really have a point with this video other than I wanted to talk about the new Animal Crossing. I've done a lot of complaining, but I only spent so long with the game because I was enjoying it. Yes, the loss of personality in favour of accommodating the player's vision is disappointing, but this isn't a zero-sum game. I can lament the loss of some of the charm and still appreciate a lot of the things it does well. I have mixed feelings towards it, but I enjoyed an awful lot about it, and everything that I didn't at least gave me something to chew on mentally, which is all I really need to be satisfied if I'm being honest. It's a weird old game. I don't think it's ever going to become a favourite, but I got a heck of a lot out of it. Walking around a space I designed with a character I get to control directly is a lovely feeling, and seeing Dunno come together across a long period of time was incredibly satisfying. I often get paralysed by these kinds of games, but New Horizons focuses the player's creativity by giving you a limited amount of content each day. As lame as it is to admit, I actually learned a lot from it. Normally I try and bash out a project as quickly as possible and burn myself out, but by forcing me to do a little bit of work every day, the game taught me a new way of working that is a lot more consistent. Hopefully that's evidenced by the fact that this video wasn't released in 2021. Structures taking time to build was frustrating at first, but maybe that frustration is just something that comes with teaching yourself a new way of thinking. The punchline to this video is that, in a lot of ways, I kinda preferred how the island looked before I started this project. Och well, the best laid schemes of raccoons and men gang after gley. Thanks so much to everybody supporting me on Patreon. Please support me there or just share this video if you enjoyed it and you would like to see more. Speaking of which, I guess I'd better get back to work on that. New Horizons has really put me in the mood for another tropical island adventure. I guess you could say I could get used to this heat on my skin.